You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to BuckeyeGrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Good Thursday, everybody. Welcome back to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast. This is a special edition. I am your host, Kyle Lamb. We're going to react to the Urban Meyer 3-game suspension. I have a lot to say on this. I'm going to try to explain this as best I can because there is a lot to be said. There are a lot of angles here. It's a very confusing situation. I know some of you are very angry, very upset. It could have been a lot worse, of course. You know, a 3-game suspension, when push comes to shove, is a relatively minor drop in the bucket. This isn't going to hurt Ohio State long-term, most likely. We don't know the recruiting ramifications. We don't know if this is going to cost Ohio State one of those first 3 games. You know, maybe the third game against TCU. Maybe they lose without Urban Meyer. Who knows? I don't think it's going to cost Ohio State in the short term. I don't think it's going to cost Ohio State in the long term. This really comes down to whether or not you think this was just. And here's the thing. So the full summary was released Wednesday night by the investigative firm. It was a 23-page report, and unlike, I suspected maybe they would release all the transcripts and all the documents, and I think those may be public records later on down the road. It's possible that there will be a trail of those documents. I'm not sure. Maybe not. Maybe this is all we'll get, this 23-page report. I thought maybe there would be more, and we would get to see some of the revelations. They interviewed 40 witnesses. They had hundreds of thousands of documents, pages of documents. Or, you know, the line from The Office, where Daryl says, you know, millions of pieces of paper material. I'm kind of thinking, I don't know what the clarification is here with the investigative firm, whether hundreds of thousands of documents or pages of documents. But regardless, we're probably not going to see all the juicy details of those transcripts. It's probably just this 23-page report. But I did read the 23-page report. And here's the interesting thing about all this. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that a suspension of Urban Meyer is unjust. Gene Smith, by the way, also being suspended. And details of the suspension, in case you're wondering, this wasn't made entirely clear, but basically Urban will not be able to have any affiliation with the team until September 3rd. So that means he will not be on the sidelines for the Oregon State game next weekend. And then beginning on September 3rd, he can return to practice and have involvement with the team, but he will miss the next 2 games against Tulane and TCU. So we will not see Urban Meyer until the 4th game of the season in mid-September. Late September, actually. Gene Smith, same deal. He will be out until September 16th. So he'll miss the same amount of time that Urban Meyer will miss. But here's the disturbing thing about this. So I think a suspension for Urban Meyer, after reading through the 23-page report, I think it's perfectly reasonable. If the committee had come back, if the panel had come back with the findings, and the Board of Trustees, in conjunction with President Michael Drake, had said, man, Urban, what were you doing, my man? You gave Zach Smith way too many opportunities. Why did you let this guy continue to be coached and employed at The Ohio State University? I mean, we know Zach has issues. He had a bad marriage, drinking problems, sex addiction, having sex with, a staff member, some lewd conduct at the White House in the 2015 visit. Just a number of things. And it turns out, going to a strip club on the company dime, partially on the company dime. Just a lot of things that Zach did continually that honestly Urban should have cut bait with him. And if the Board of Trustees and Michael Drake had come to Urban after this report and said, we're going to suspend you for this because it turns out, you did everything wrong with how you handled the 2015 domestic abuse allegations. You did that perfectly. You and Gene Smith both. You did everything that could have reasonably been expected of you. But we don't like your managerial discretion in keeping Zach Smith employed by the university. If they had done that, we wouldn't be having a conversation right now because I think we could all agree, if you read the report, it's pretty fair. If you give Urban a 3-game suspension for that, I don't think any Ohio State fans, being honest with themselves, can really disagree with that conclusion. Because it's a bad look. Urban did everything he needed to do in 2015, which I'll get to here in a second, because this is the great irony of all this. But when push comes to shove, when you're a supervisor, when you're a CEO, a manager, at the end of the day, you're still responsible for the conduct of your employees. Maybe not on a micro level. That's not to say it's Urban's fault that Zach goes out and goes to a strip club on a recruiting trip in Florida in 2014. I'm not saying Urban should be responsible for that. But if there's a repeated behavior, repeated conduct involved, then at some point you got to stand up and take ownership of it. If you're the CEO, Urban, like Jim Tressel, preaches to his guys that perception matters. He preaches to his players that you are representing your university. Okay, you're putting on the jersey, you're representing the university, and perception matters. It shouldn't always, not as much as it does, but it does. It does matter. And if you're Urban Meyer and you preach that to your players, remember Carlos Hyde served a 3-game suspension several years ago, and it turns out he did not do anything wrong, but it was perception. He served the suspension because he put himself in a position that was detrimental to perception, okay? And so if you're Urban Meyer, you cannot let yourself off the hook. You've got to be responsible for the same attitude, the same mindset. And Urban Meyer put himself in a position with his managerial discretion that Zach Smith, let's be honest, Zach Smith was given too long a leash. And so I think we all are agreeing he probably should have been fired. And leave out what you think of Zach Smith as a receivers coach. That has nothing to do with it. You just look at his conduct, his behavior, his pattern. He probably should have been let go. And I'm not even sure, we don't even know if he ever abused Courtney Smith, his now ex-wife. We just don't know that. We probably will, well, not probably, we will never likely know if that really happened. So set aside domestic abuse, set aside what kind of coach he was. I think critically, Urban Meyer made a mistake not firing Zach Smith. Does that mean Urban should be fired? No, I don't think so. But I think he can be accountable to poor managerial decisions. I think he allowed Zach Smith to hang around too long. That's on him. Okay, but here's the great irony. And this is kind of rubs me the wrong way. When you read this report, you find, okay, the subject of mandatory reporting, a little bit of a gray area. It basically concludes that Urban and Gene should have notified their supervisors, but at the same time, they didn't commit any violations of law, of policy, or of contractual obligations, okay? So they should have reported, but they didn't necessarily break the law or break policy or contract by not reporting. It's a gray area. It's like we've discussed, the infamous Reddit attorney. He's written a lot about this. I've written some columns. I've talked about it on Twitter a lot. Catch me on Twitter, by the way, at KYLam8, of course. You know what? We've talked about how the sexual misconduct policy for Ohio State, as it pertains to reporting off-campus domestic abuse allegations, is written very confusing. It's very unclear as to exactly what the role and responsibility is to report stuff that happens off campus. Because the sexual misconduct policy itself applies on campus. And there is a part in there that allows for off-campus reporting, but that is the Title IX coordinator's discretion, and it's up to them to decide when it creates a hostile environment on campus. Things that could impact the campus environment, that is when reporting comes into play. The report concluded Title IX absolutely doesn't apply. Sexual misconduct does not apply to Courtney Smith because she is the spouse of somebody that was off campus. It doesn't apply to her, but the gray area exists whether this should have been reported to the Title IX office. Now, just for sake of clarity, there is a Title IX coordinator that oversees the entire university, and then there are deputy Title IX coordinators that oversee each department. In this case, in 2015, Michelle Willis was the Title IX deputy coordinator for athletics, okay? The report concludes that the Powell Police Department in October 2015 called the Ohio State campus police to inform them of an allegation against Zach Smith. Campus police took down the allegation, reported this to Michelle Willis as deputy coordinator of Title IX for the athletics department. She then contacts Gene Smith to let Gene Smith know, hey, assistant coach Zach Smith has been alleged to have been in a domestic incident with his wife, Courtney, just passing this information along. So Willis at this point takes down the allegation in her office, does what she needs to do with it, passes it along to Gene Smith, who then goes to Urban Meyer and says, hey, Urban, I got this allegation you need to be aware of. Zach was accused by Courtney of domestic abuse. At this point, both Gene and Urban, already aware that the Title IX coordinator for their athletic department, Michelle Willis, knows about the allegation, decides to do nothing more. What reason do we have to report this? The person we would report it to already knows about this incident. So, if you're Urban and Gene, you're then monitoring the situation. They keep in contact with the Powell Police Department. They find out this investigation goes nowhere. Zach Smith is not going to be arrested. Zach Smith is not going to be charged. And so they do nothing with it. So this report concludes, despite the fact they're superior as far as it pertains to reporting the allegation, despite the fact she already knew, they're coming back now, and Ohio State is saying, Ohio State and the investigative firm is saying, well, you knew, the person you were supposed to report it to already knew, but we find you still should have reported it. That does not make any sense. If the person you would be reporting it to already had made a written record of it, common sense should tell you there's no reason to go back and make another report. It makes no sense. Okay? And the report goes on to conclude, by the way, that Urban Meyer did, like he said at the press conference, on Media Day back in July 23rd to be exact, Urban did, in fact, text members of his staff, Brian Voltolini and Stamper. He did text them asking, hey, what's the deal with this report? They checked on it, and they told him, yeah, there's nothing to it. We have no arrest record of Zach Smith in 2015. So Urban was not lying about that. He did, in fact, ask about a report of an arrest because he did not know of any arrest in 2015. That part, turns out, it was truthful. Now, he did later become aware, he was reminded of the 2015 allegation, and Gene Smith, in a text message, apparently tells Urban Meyer, just be sure if you're addressing it at media days, don't go into detail about it. So if you're Urban Meyer, you're going into Chicago, you're getting asked this question. I think he's basically doing both. I think he was protecting Zach Smith. I think he was following the wishes of Gene Smith not to go into detail about it. So from that standpoint, maybe he wasn't being entirely truthful, but I also think he was responding, as the night before suggests with his text messages for the staff. I think he was responding to the fact that, hey, we looked into this, there was no arrest in 2015. So I think he was being truthful in the spirit of the question, and text messages seem to corroborate that. The problem, though, is in the press conference Wednesday night, even though Mary Jo White, the lead of the investigative firm that looked into all this, even though she established she did not think Urban was being untruthful, she thought that Urban was telling the truth about media days. Even though she came to that conclusion, it came off in this press conference as Ohio State saying, you didn't lie, but you weren't telling the truth, and we're going to suspend you for it. So here's the irony, the summation, if you will, okay? Big picture, the wild goose chase that led us down this path as it pertains to domestic abuse allegations against Zach Smith made by his ex-wife Courtney. And what did Urban Meyer know? When did he know it? What did he do with it? This is what started us down this path, and it turns out Urban was being absolutely truthful with everything he's told us. It turns out he knew about the allegations and reported it. It turns out the committee concluded that the initial report made by Brett McMurphy was erroneous. Remember that wedding singer? Erroneous. Erroneous. Okay? The report by Brett McMurphy was erroneous. He reported there was an arrest in 2015. That was not factual. Urban Meyer was responding truthfully to that. Even if he may have known and remembered the incident in 2015, I think he was responding truthfully to the report as it had been framed the day before. So, what led us down this path was the allegation against Zach Smith and whether Urban Meyer knew about it and responded to it. According to the report, he knew about it, his supervisor knew about it, the deputy Title IX coordinator knew about it, and he wasn't lying to the media. But Ohio State suspended him for 3 games despite those facts. Why? Here's the disturbing part. So, if this would have been about what I mentioned earlier, and Urban just giving too long of a leash to an employee, in this case Zach Smith, I would be completely fine today as we sit here and discuss the 3-game suspension. But I'll tell you what happened. I know there are some reports that came out Wednesday. Why did this last 12 hours before they finally came out to a press conference? And I know people are shaking an angry fist right now at President Michael Drake. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you Michael Drake had nothing to do with this, but here's what I know. If the Board of Trustees wanted to call a vote, they could have overruled Michael Drake. Michael Drake just has one vote. If it goes to a vote and they had voted on this as to what to do, Michael Drake loses if the majority agrees on no suspension, okay? If they wanted to let Urban Meyer walk with no suspension, they could have done that. Michael Drake could not have stopped that. Ideally, do you want President Drake on board with what you're doing? Absolutely. You definitely do. I think they wanted unanimous, but that was never going to happen. You can't get 20 people in a room and be unanimous on almost anything. You put 20 people in a room and ask them, hey, do you want free cookies? Do you like cookies? Not all 20 are going to want a cookie. Not all 20 are going to like cookies. Just the way life is. You're not going to agree on everything, okay? You put 20 people together, it's never going to be unanimous. So if the Board of Trustees wanted to make that decision without Michael Drake, they could have done so. The idea that Drake was the one holding this up is just, in my opinion, it's wrong. I'm not saying he wasn't a factor. He could have been a factor. But I think those leaks saying that Michael Drake was responsible, I think there's a motivation here. And I think it's because there is a certain other member of the board, a very influential member, and I'm not going to say the person by name. You know, if you look at my Twitter tweet feed on Wednesday evening, you probably can figure out who I'm talking about. But I think this person is responsible. I think this person wanted Urban fired for the domestic abuse allegations. And this person is very powerful, very influential. This person, unlike Michael Drake, absolutely an influencer at Ohio State and could have derailed these discussions. This is the kind of thing that you got to be treading lightly when you're making a decision. So what I think happened here is I think that this person did not want to reinstate Urban Meyer where most of the trustees did. I think Drake was probably on the fence. Maybe Drake wanted a suspension, but I think Drake could have been swayed either way. And I think this was a compromise. The 3 games was a compromise. And because the actual allegations that the committee went out to find and the reason they were tasked with this investigation, they were supposed to only answer 3 main questions that were pertaining to the 2015 allegations, okay? The other stuff regarding Zach Smith was not their primary goal. That was not what they were looking for in the investigation. So with that said, I think Ohio State came back and said, as a compromise, we're going to suspend you for 3 games. And if we're suspending you, then we have to suspend Gene Smith for the same amount of time because he also knew about the 2015 incident. They made the decision that was the punishment, and therefore they had to make the crime fit the punishment rather than the punishment fit the crime. And so what you get is a PR nightmare because Ohio State was trying to make it look like they suspended Urban Meyer and Gene Smith for failure to report domestic abuse allegations, when in reality, there was no reason to suspend either one for any of this stuff. The witch hunt, the goose chase, everything that sent us to this point in time was not wrongdoing. Okay? Urban Meyer and Gene Smith should not be suspended for those reasons. If the committee, the investigative panel, the firm that was actually doing the investigating, and the 6-person panel that was serving as the intermediary, if they had the authority to chase down Zach Smith's behavior and Urban Meyer, how he reacted to Zach Smith's behavior, if they had that authority, if that was part of the reason that they're investigating, Ohio State would have just come back easily and just said, we'll suspend you for that reason, okay? And like I said earlier, it would have been warranted. A 3-game suspension, in the grand scheme of things, probably deserved today for Urban Meyer. I'm not arguing that. I think if you search your heart, if you read the whole 23-page report, I think you agree it's not so much that the 3-game suspension was unfair to Urban Meyer. That's not the issue here. It's that they're trying to appease the domestic violence crowd, and ironically, that crowd is not appeased. Nobody's happy by this. That crowd thinks Urban should have been terminated, but they've got false facts. Okay? The committee came back basically showing Urban and Gene did not do anything wrong as it pertains to the Courtney Smith allegations. Now, there's some other disturbing things in there, like the conversation by text message back in August with Brian Boltolini and Urban Meyer about erasing text messages prior to 1 year's time. That's very disturbing, and I'd like to know more about that. But that is also unclear. We don't know if Brian initiated that conversation. It wasn't clear if Urban initiated the conversation. And we don't know if they are hiding something or if they were just being careful. Who knows what happened there? That's a disturbing fact of this report, but we don't know anything from that. Bottom line is the thing that got us to this point, domestic abuse, there's nothing here. Urban Meyer did nothing wrong as far as domestic abuse, okay? The committee even concluded he takes domestic abuse seriously. They think he has integrity when it comes to treating women. They concluded that in the report. They believe that's the case. Gene Smith did nothing wrong. Nothing that has been, slung at Gene Smith or specifically Urban Meyer by the media is borne out by fact, according to this 23-page report. There's just nothing there. And the irate nature, the witch hunt of domestic violence does not apply in this situation. If you want to believe Zach Smith abused Courtney, you're doing so without any proof, but go right ahead. I'm not telling you not to. I'm not telling you Zach Smith is a great guy. He clearly has his demons. But to the extent that this impacts Ohio State, this was a witch hunt, and this was borne out by the report. I have a problem with the 3-game suspension only because this was a manufactured crisis, and they are reacting to false facts that were not spelled out in the report. Conclusions that were not made in the report, they're trying to retrofit to fit the punishment that they decided they have to do because of public relations purposes. And again, this isn't helping the PR game. It didn't win. They lost. Everybody loses in this. Everybody. Just like this whole situation, everybody is a loser. Okay, Zach Smith, Courtney Smith, everybody in the situation has lost thanks to all this drama. So, bottom line, Urban Meyer will be back to coaching later in September. We'll see him. He's going to be out of the mix for the first 3 games. It's probably not going to change Ohio State's season. I still believe they'll go 3-0 in that time. I don't think it's going to change anything going forward. I think Urban Meyer will be reinstated. I think this will blow over. There might be a few embarrassing moments along the way. It was tough to see him defeated in that press conference. That rehearsed line where basically, I trust President Drake's decision, he really sounded like a hostage. He sounded like he was being forced to read a letter, written to him by his captor. It was depressing to see Urban Meyer reduced to such a defeatist attitude, but that's how it came across. But he'll be back. Ohio State's program, barring anything else, they'll be back. It might hurt recruiting in the short term. We'll see. We'll talk to Mark Gibler here in the very near future about how this will impact recruiting. We'll see how maybe it will, maybe it won't. We just don't know. But Urban will be back. The program will be back. This is a short-term setback. My biggest takeaway here, I think the 3-game suspension is fine, but they did it for all the wrong reasons, and they did it in the name of domestic abuse and how it should be responded to. And I hate that because in a sad irony, the people that were on a witch hunt win, even though they don't even think they won because they demand total justice. And to them, the only way they would have been happy on this day is if Urban Meyer was fired. They didn't want due process. They didn't want facts to come out. They wanted Urban Meyer fired. You can't argue with that logic because in their mind, as soon as the allegation is made, you either fire the person or you should be fired right along with them. You can't argue with that. So today, those people weren't happy because Urban Meyer wasn't fired, but yet Ohio State caved into trying to appease those people. What happens? Exactly what happened. Gene Smith and Urban Meyer were suspended for all the wrong reasons in the world. So, anyhow, this is a strange, bizarre saga. It's not going to be done because Brett McMurphy is going to continue piling dirt. Courtney and Zach Smith are going to continue to sling mud at each other. That's going to play out in court. This has not been a good situation for Ohio State, for Urban Meyer, for Gene Smith. But there you have it. Urban Meyer serving a 3-game suspension, will be back September 16th. Through September 16th. Gene Smith serving a same suspension through September 16th. And then he will be back as well. All maybe the right punishment. Definitely the wrong reasons. Anyhow, I appreciate everybody listening to me. I hate that it's under these circumstances. I will be back again tomorrow with another edition of Unscripted Ohio. And then, of course, I'll be back Monday with our normal Monday edition as well. So, Next week will be game week. We'll get into Ohio State, Oregon State coverage, and then from there, we'll be back on a normal schedule as things will get back to normal around here, hopefully, after a month-long amount of drama. It'll be good to get back to talking football, and then, of course, eventually we'll talk some basketball, too, as we get closer to basketball season. But I appreciate you giving me a listen. Catch me on Twitter at KYLAM8. Catch the show Monday and Fridays on BuckeyeGrove.com. You can catch us on the archives, SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. Thanks for listening to Unscripted Ohio, everybody. We'll catch you again tomorrow. Go Bucks.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.